All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started today. So last week we finished up our section on pragmatics and syntax, and we scheduled the test. And I think not everybody has gotten that done yet, but we got a majority of people who have completed that. So this week, it looks like if we go over to Canvas for a minute, let me see where we are here. I can tell you what we're going to be doing this week. Looking at the modules. So we're getting into psycholinguistics today. So module 14 here, we have November 22nd, child language acquisition theories, second language acquisition theories, the 24th dialect versus language, American tongues. We might watch part of something on YouTube if I have time to do that, and maybe a little bit more about dialects. So we'll see. Sometimes I get bogged down by these, see how much we can get to, but we do have one more. I'm going to just call it the final exam, but the final exam will basically cover whatever it is we talked about this week, pretty much, and that's going to be it. It's not going to be anything major. It'll be pretty short. I'm guessing maybe 10-15 minutes. It'll be all multiple choice, won't be that difficult. So this is kind of where we are right now. So it looks like today we're going to get into this area here, child language acquisition, and then second language acquisition, see how far we can go there. Okay, so let's get into in the semantics. I'm not really going to worry about that too much. You can look at it on your own. It's very easy. Maybe point out a couple of things. You know, synonyms and antonyms, right? So the key to a synonym is there are two words that are similar in some way, but maybe not exactly the same way. Or antonyms, two words which are in some way opposite, but maybe not exactly opposite. So it's hard to have an exact synonym or an exact antonym. Okay, let's keep going here. Okay, let's get into child language acquisition. So let's take a look at some statements here and see what you guys think about this. So these are just true or false. See what you guys think about this. It says children learn a language by simply memorizing words and sentences. You think that's true or false?
True.
I'm going to say in this one, it's false, because simply means only by memorizing words and sentences. So children learn by memorizing, to be sure, but probably that's not the only way that children acquire a language. So we'll say this one is false. How about number two? Children are able to comprehend novel utterances, sentences that they have never heard before. Is it possible for a child to hear something new for the first time and understand it? Believe it or not, I'm going to put on this one, according to a lot of research, I'm going to say true, that they can come up with new things and understand new things, even though it may not have been said to the child before. How about three? Children should be explicitly taught the rules so they can learn the language creatively. It's important for parents to teach subject-verb agreement, the difference between non-restrictive adjective and restrictive adjective clauses. You have to teach them the affixes commonly attached to words that form adjectives, nouns, adverbs, and verbs. Do parents need to teach those things explicitly to their children, especially when they're, say, 1, 2, and 3 years old? Yeah, in this case, doesn't seem to be that important. Most parents, they do no explicit teaching whatsoever. They just interact with their children. That's typically what happens. There's not a lot of instruction going on, especially at a young age, you know, when a child is 6 months, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years old, that kind of a thing. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. So number 4, it says true or false. And think about when you came into this class in the beginning of this semester, think about how aware you were of the phonetics, the IPA, and how natural that seemed to you in the beginning of this course. The morphological, syntactic, and semantic rules. Adults usually are more aware of phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic rules than are the children. You guys think true or false? So we're at number 4 here. Believe it or not, on this one, adults are no more aware of these things than children are. If you go up to somebody and say, give me an example of an adverb, they're dumbfounded. If you say, what's the past tense form of blah, 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 or do you know what the difference is between the past perfect and the simple past? Adults can tell you really nothing when it comes to those things. They simply are just not very aware of those things. Nobody is really aware. Children aren't, adults aren't, nobody. The exception would be adults who learned a second language. Somebody like me, I learned Spanish when I was 20. That's the first time I couldn't even say "Cómo estás?" Nothing. So when I learned Spanish as an adult, that really made me a lot more aware of my own language. So there is exceptions, right? Non-native speakers and things of that nature, people that teach ESL like me, you know, lawyers. There are people, politicians even, can be really particularly, they can pay really close attention to the language they use. They know how to use it in ways, in some cases, to deceive even, to hide or mislead information. Okay, let's take a look at number 5. And these things are kind of based on research, right? Research regarding child language acquisition. Children make up the rules of the language as they go along. What do you guys think? True or false? Is it possible for children to create the rules of the language? False?
Yeah.
Yeah, on this one, believe it or not, there's a lot of research out there that says children are actively involved in creating or constructing the rules of the language. They can put it together. And I think the key here to number 5 is as long as they have a language-rich environment, they have to have that environment. They have to be talked to, interacted with, right? They need a lot of interaction. And with that interaction, they're able to put together the language, really. Okay, let's look at number 6 here. A 40-month-old child who says, I got my feet wet, is not speaking correctly. He or she will need a lot of instruction from his or her parents before getting the grammar right.
False.
That's right. In this case, a 40-month-old child, you got roughly a little over 3 years, right? Actually, there's a lot of things going on in this sentence that look pretty good, right? The child number 1 is using the simple past tense form of an irregular verb, get versus got. So the child knows irregular verbs. Now here, you see the child's use of the determiner, and the child has syntax by saying, I got my feet wet, right? So the child has an understanding of subject verbs and objects and all that, and even uses an adjective at the end there. Notice the use of the word feet, right? Feet is the irregular form of the noun foot, but then the child overgeneralized and applied the S on the irregular stem changing down there. But there's a lot of things going on here that are working very well for a child at that age. This child will probably not need any instruction at all from his or her parents before getting the grammar right. There's probably nothing to be concerned about at all based on what we see here. Now, there was my church on Sunday, I listened, the first speaker in our meeting was a 13-year-old autistic boy. And in my church, sometimes they have youth speakers. So he's part of the youth. My son is 13. He knows the kid. His name's Scott, right? So the kid gets up and he starts speaking. And in front of me was a speech therapist who works at one of the school districts in the high desert, right? And bottom line is, I couldn't understand more than 25% of anything this kid said. I could not understand anything, hardly at all, nothing, right? And I asked the person in front of me, I said, well, how much can you understand? She said she understood everything that he said. I'm like, wow, because she's trained. She works with kids with special needs and all those things. And this kid being homeschooled, right, doesn't even go to a school. I don't even know if he's getting any speech therapy at all, but I talked to the dad after church. He said they did speech therapy with him for a while and they just gave up. He said it was pointless. He wasn't progressing at all with any type of, but the lady told me, who was sitting in front of me, I said, was it possible, can he speak more intelligibly, or is he past the critical period? He's 13. There's a lot of research out that says when you get past the age of the pubescent period, around becoming a teenager, the brain kind of goes through changes and things. It becomes very difficult to make any changes at all, phonetic and phonological and so on. And also he has autism, which is a whole nother thing you got to throw into it, right? She said that, in her opinion, with intensive therapy for many years, he could probably get more intelligible than he is right now. That's what she said. Parents disagree with it, but that's what she said. Who knows? But okay, let's go to the next one. This is kind of an interesting one here. So number 7, it says, it is not useful to correct a child's grammar. And let's talk about children that are especially young, 1, 2, 3 years old, those in that age group. It is not useful to correct a child's grammar. Corrections by adults appear to be essentially without value to the child. What do you guys think about that? Believe it or not, this one's actually true. There doesn't seem to be a lot of value and results in correcting children's grammar, especially when they're young ages. And most parents, they've watched parents when they do correct. Parents are more likely to not correct the grammar of what the child says, but to correct the truth of what the child is saying. So if the child points to something and says dog, that's dog, dog, but if it's actually a cat, the parents are more likely to correct that than if the child says, I go store yesterday. A lot of parents probably would not correct I go. You need to say went there because it's a simple path. A lot of parents, they worry more about the truthfulness of the statement. Is the statement accurate? Is the observation accurate? And they'll offer a lot of corrections in that way, but many parents offer really no grammatical corrections whatsoever. Yet, children still seem to acquire the language, right? Okay, so let's go over some of these things. So just one more time. So we said that children learn a language simply by memorizing words and sentences. A lot of the research says that's true. I mean, false. That children actually learn not just by memorizing, but there's other ways of learning the language other than just memorizing. Children are able to comprehend novel utterances, sentences they have never heard before. That's actually true. Children should be explicitly taught the rules so they can learn the language creatively. That's false. Most children are never taught the rules of the language, yet they use the language creatively, thoughtfully, and with a high degree of fluency. 4, usually adults are more aware of the phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic rules than are the children. False. Nobody really is that aware of any of this stuff. They're just not very aware at all. So parents aren't, or adults are not, children are not. Number 5, children make up the rules of the language as they go along. And believe it or not, this is actually true so long as there is a language-rich environment. That's the key. There needs to be a lot of interaction going on. And you'll see, sometimes you might see somebody driving on the freeway, right? There'll be a kid in the back in a little car seat, and you'll see the parent up front talking. You say, why is he talking? And the kid's only 2 years old or 3 years old, but they say that kind of interaction is really, really important to begin talking to children at very young ages and interact with them. Number 6, a 40-month-old child who says, I got my feet wet, is not speaking correctly. This is actually false. This kid will probably not need really any instruction at all before getting the grammar right. Right, won't need much at all. And then it's not useful to correct a child's grammar. It appears to be without value. There is research that indicates that, especially if the child is young, 1, 2, 3 years old. So we can say with that one, that's actually true. So these are just some basic preliminaries in child language acquisition. Okay, let's move ahead. So getting into the next part, this is called the emergence of language, stages of child language acquisition. I will ask you about these. I'll give you some descriptors of things, and then you have to tell me what stage of child language acquisition that might be. It says, all over the world, children begin to use language at the same time in similar ways. By their 18th to the 28th month, children normally begin to speak. Not all mothers begin to teach their children language at that time. In fact, many mothers initiate no special training or systematic teaching to their children at all. Yet the children still seem to learn the language. So what factors may set a language in motion in a child? Is it something in the environment that triggers a child and makes a child want to learn the language? Or is there some kind of internal biological clock, or LAD, language acquisition device, that is set into motion, causing the child internally and automatically to begin to learn a language? List some factors that you think may cause a child to begin to learn a language. Okay, let's see if we can get some ideas here. So initially, why do you think a child begins to learn the language? We'll put some ideas here and then we'll kind of go from there.
I say environment.
Okay. Okay, we'll put that environment that is language rich, or a language rich environment, maybe better say it that way. Think about your observations of children. Okay, we got one there. What else? Okay. The need to put the need to interact with family members to become part of the whole deal. Did you guys know I read an article earlier today? The family structure in the US is actually declining. There's more and more people deciding not to have any children at all. And I think the average family is 1.7 children right now in the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that all families have only 1 or 2 children. There's a lot of families, 4, 5, 6, whatever. But if you look average and you go all over the US. Okay, so we got language rich environment, the need to interact with family members. What else? So some factors that you think may cause a child to begin to learn a language.
They want to communicate their needs.
Okay. Let's get one more and then we'll move on. So far, language-rich environment, the need to interact with family members, the desire to communicate their needs, a diaper needs to be changed, child is hungry. So they're trying to get across these things. But remember, when a child is only, say, 12 months or 1 year old, or 12 months or 2 years old or whatever, they're only limited, really. They can only use maybe 1 or 2 words at the most, right? You see how frustrating that is? When you're that age, you know what you want in your mind, right? But you can't communicate that. So you get babies and toddlers, they cry a lot. You know, they're frustrated. They're trying to get their meaning across, but they can't. And then they kind of go crazy sometimes. And that's what the parents are. Parents have to try to figure out what those needs are. Okay, what else?
To like acquire communication skills, like
Okay. So to acquire communication skills. All right. Now, everything we're looking at here, pretty much, we're focusing a lot on the environment. And it seems that the environment is important. Unfortunately, we've had a few instances in the world and in American history where you've had a child who was chained to a bed, who wasn't interacted with at all from like 0 all the way to teenage years. And this child had no language at all. There's an example, they call her Jeannie. They found her at around 13 or 14 years old, and she had really no language whatsoever. And the question was, well, what can somebody learn at that point? Are they past the critical period? Can they learn? And they found out, in Jeannie's case and other children similar to that they can never fully acquire the first language if they didn't acquire it at an early age. It becomes, especially the phonetics, the syntax of the language, you know, being able to use the past tense verbs and all that stuff becomes almost impossible for a child to learn if they've not been introduced to the language during, say, 0 all the way up to puberty, that area. Okay, so in addition to looking at language as being environmental, there's research out there that looks at it as a biological behavior, something that kind of starts. And it's not a conscious thing in many cases. So it says, in defense of language as a biologically triggered behavior, thinking about these ideas here for a minute. So we have first, the behavior emerges before it's necessary. So children begin to try to use the language. They begin making a lot of noise, even at 3 months old. They call it cooing. They go from cooing to babbling. At about 6 months, babbling, da, 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 ma, 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 da, 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 ba, da, da. They start really making noises and things. Number 2, the child does not make a conscious decision to begin learning the language. It seems to be automatic. It just kind of happens. The emergence of language is not triggered by external events here. However, the environment must be, as we said before, rich for a child's language to develop adequately. They have to have the input. And from that input, the child begins constructing a language. But without the input, there's no way for the child to do that. There is likely to be a critical period for the acquisition of a language. So it seems to be, there's a lot of research out there that says that language is time sensitive. It cannot be fully acquired at just any age, the first language especially. So there seems to be some sensitivity to when that language needs to be acquired. Number 5, direct teaching and intensive practice, believe it or not, have relatively little effect on a child's ability to learn a language. And you can put maybe in parentheses, especially when the child is at a really young age, 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, that kind of a thing. And then number 5, there is a regular sequence of milestones as the language develops in a child, and these milestones can usually be correlated with age and other aspects of the child's development. So these 6 things here, they seem to suggest that even though the environment is important, there are some biologically kind of connected things to a child learning a language. So keep those things in mind. Okay, so let's take a look at, we're getting into what's called the milestones in child language acquisition. We call these universal stages. Now, the key here is there's a lot of variation from one child to the next. Notice how the ranges are very broad. So you have to be careful if you know a child or have a child. Well, my child is not at that stage yet. And there's always going to be some differences with this. My wife and I, our child did not go through these exact stages. As you see here, our child was born, he didn't breathe for the first 30 minutes of his life. And after that, he had some trouble. And when he was in TK, we actually had him repeat. He could have gone from TK, I guess he went to kindergarten after that, but then from kindergarten, he goes to first, and we didn't want him to go to first yet. So we had him repeat kindergarten twice. And that seemed to be very helpful for our child. And he's now in 7th grade. He should be in 8th grade, but he's all caught up. He's doing his math, his writing, everything seems to be good. But initially, he didn't go through exactly these milestones. I mean, he wasn't even, when he was 5 or 6 years old, I honestly still could not understand him at all. My wife knew what he was saying. She was more familiar with what he was, but he had a lot of problems. And he had speech therapy all the way until the 6th grade. So last year he graduated from speech therapy, but it was pretty intense. He did speech therapy every week for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours every week for several years. I'm going to say maybe 8 years. And then he got to where he's very intelligible now. Okay, here's what we call the milestones. The first one is cooing. This is 3 to 12 months. Child plays with the vocal apparatus, though not yet making linguistic noises. You definitely hear the child making noise, but not necessarily sounds or words. 2 is babbling. 6 to 12 months would be a range here. Child is playing with linguistic sounds, but for the child, the sounds may not yet carry meaning. All children do this, even deaf children, interesting enough. And that's the key. Why do deaf children babble if they don't hear anything in the environment? Right? That goes to that biologically triggered behavior. The difference between a non-hearing and a hearing child is the non-hearing child will babble, but it won't go beyond that. This child will never get into sounds or words or anything like that because the child can't hear anything. That child's going to have to learn American Sign Language, that kind of a thing. Okay, number 3, we get into the one word or what's called the halophrastic stage, 8 to 18 months. Not simply labeling objects, the child uses one word to convey meanings which will later be expressed by complex phrases and sentences. The child conveys meaning through the use of intonation. The child says, wow, wow, where are you? Or, what's that? Or no can be an assertion, or I don't want to go, or an imperative, don't do that. So the child can use one word to do different types of speech acts. It said the child's able to understand and perceive many more phonological contrasts than he can produce. So that's why they say at that stage, talk to the child as much as possible, even though they can't say a lot, they can understand a lot. You have number 4, you have what's called the 2-word stage, 8 to 18 months. 2 words are strung together with syntactic and semantic relations. Examples, daddy bye-bye, mommy book, boo all gone, reduplication in telegraphic speech used. Reduplication is to dad, dad, mama. They repeat part of one word, repeat it a second time, that kind of a thing. So this is called the 2-word. And then we get to the last one here, the 3 or more word stage, age 2 to 4 years. You look at the characteristics here, function words omitted, things like determiners, prepositions, and auxiliary verbs. A child uses mostly content words, which means nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and verbs. Syntax is evident at this stage. So they're putting together, 3 or more words in there. So they actually have good sentences, subject, verbs, objects, all that kind of stuff. So that would be the 3 or more word stage. And after that, there's really nothing else. A lot of they pretty much stop. Once a child gets to 3 or more stage, exponentially, it just goes crazy. They say sometimes 50 words a day a child can learn. It's crazy. They just become this sponge and just soaking everything into the brain, and they just take off like crazy. So these are the actual milestones. And the thing is this goes back to what we said earlier. If language were solely an environmental thing, why would there be these milestones? And why do most children go through similar stages? Because if we're just an environmental thing, language, right? It would, different children would do different things. And it wouldn't be the same from one language to the next, one culture to the next, and so on. But there seems to be these milestones I just showed you. They're pretty common, and they're very, very similar from one child to the next. And notice in this case, you have 3 to 12 here. You have a pretty wide range. You have babbling 6 to 12 months. You have the 1 word 8 to 18 months, and then you have the 18 to 24 months, and then 2 to 4 years, we get into the last one there. So that kind of shows you how that works there. Okay, so let's take a look at what we call some phonological morphological and syntactic features. So this is going to give you some examples of common things that you might notice when a child speaks and uses a language, right? So a child produces the simple sounds and then to the more difficult, complex sound combinations. Initially, the R is usually substituted with a W. So instead of right, the child may say white, white. Consonants omitted in consonant clusters. So for example, instead of saying PL, play, the child may say pay. Or instead of spun, the child may say pun. An easier sound may be substituted for a more difficult sound, kind of like you see up here. So instead of saying the word bath, the child may say bass. Instead of brother, the child may say brother, 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 mother. So the child will substitute easier sounds for more difficult sounds. These will be common things that you would see when children are using English, when they're learning English for the first time. You'll notice these kinds of things. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. We have Paul at age 2 said the following. So we have, for the word son, Paul says son. For the word sea, he says sea. For the word spoon, Paul says poon. For the word snake, Paul says nake. For sky, Paul says kai. For stop, Paul says top. That would be what he would do there. Now the question here is, state the principle that describes Paul's pronunciation of these words. So what is he doing here? We have poon, nake, kai, top. So Paul is what?
Not pronouncing the S.
That's right. So in those cases, that's right. He's not pronouncing the S when it's in a consonant cluster. When it's the first sound in a consonant cluster. That's what we can say there. Then it says, based on that principle, transcribe the following words as Paul might pronounce them. So the first one is probably the same thing, right? Take. So how would Paul say the word snow? Probably just no, right? How would he say straight? Probably wouldn't say the S, but you still have a TR, which is another consonant cluster. He's also going to have trouble with the R. You'll probably substitute the R for the W, and you might get even this, something like that. Wait. Instead of straight, straight. Okay, we have this one. We have Mike. How do you think he'll say snake? Kind of like that. And then how about the word spot? Probably not going to say the S here. So we have that, right? It says here, should the parents be concerned about Paul's pronunciation at age 2? Think they should be concerned?
No.
Yeah, probably not, right? Because he's 2 years old, and what he's doing seems to be typical of what children would do at that age, right? They substitute easier for more difficult sounds. They omit a sound in a consonant cluster and those kinds of things. So it doesn't seem to be anything unusual going on there. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of other things. So we have phonological, morphological, and syntactic features. Take a look at a few more examples here. So we have morphology and syntax. We have a child overgeneralizes morphological and syntactic rules, especially the past tense and plural inflectional morphemes. There's a lot of overgeneralization. So you have, this shows you different examples of how a child might say a word. You have walk, then walk it, or walk it, and then walked. Finally, the child will get to this. Or you have boy, boyses, and then finally boys. Or you have man, mans, manses, mans, and then finally men. So the child could have different variations of these words as a child is learning the inflectional ED or the inflectional past tense and the inflectional plural S endings. Function morphemes are acquired in a sequence with little or no variation from child to child. So it looks like children, they learn the ing first. If you think about it, the child is concerned about what's happening. I am talking, I am hungry, I am eating something. They're really worried about that continuous and that progressive. They use that first, then the plural S ending, then the possessive S, then the introduction of the articles they'll start using to some degree, then the past tense ED, then the third person singular S, and then finally the auxiliary be verb. The be verb as in I was watching TV or something. They might say I watching TV for many years at first. Now eventually they'll say I was watching. They'll put the be verb in there. Other examples, negations, you have no mommy go, mommy no go, I not tired until the appearance of the be verb. So those would be things that you would also see. Interrogatives, 2 word plus intonation. They might say, instead of using the auxiliary verb, so saying is mommy going, they just say mommy going, mommy going. So they'll put the tone up a little bit to make it a question. Yes, no questions with auxiliary can and will. You have WH questions without inversion, where mommy is going, instead of where is mommy going. So they might not know how to do the subject verb inversion with either yes, no questions or WH questions initially. That would be something that you would notice when children are using the language there. Couple of other things. It says child overgeneralizes and uses a word to refer to many things in the same class. Dog, all 4-legged animals. Daddy could mean all men. And I remember when I was a kid, I thought that all dogs were male and all cats were female. I remember knowing that for some reason. I don't know why, but I remember now remembering that I thought that. Okay, let's move ahead. The last part of what we want to talk about today is called theories of child language acquisition. So, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about initially, right? A lot of these preliminaries that we looked at, these true false things here, we saw in the beginning of our class today, the different theories will kind of hit into these areas. And the best way to look at, I think, a theory is that's exactly what they are. Nobody knows exactly how a child learns a language in the brain. There's just a lot of things that we don't know and don't understand. But at least with these 3 theories, if you look at the imitation theory, you look at the other 2 theories, if you put them all together, they seem to do a pretty good job explaining how language acquisition works. But if you only look at one theory without considering the other 2, there's some weak points in there. They don't seem to fully, each theory doesn't fully explain how the language is acquired. So imitation theory, very easy to remember that children learn by imitating what they hear in the environment, right? That's the basic thing. The strength, at least some of the language is acquired through hearing and reproducing those sounds. Weakness, this theory does not explain how children can come up with novel utterances that they have not heard before. So the child says, my nose is crying. But yet the parents never said that. They never said it that way. So the question is, well, how did the child come up with that sentence if it's not imitating it? Weakness, not all language is acquired through imitation. Even when a child tries to imitate, they often can't. So in the following conversational exchange, a researcher tried in vain to coax a child to imitate him. So you have my teacher holding the baby rabbits and we patted them. Did you say your teacher held the baby rabbits? Yes. Notice how the adult's trying to model this. What did you say she did? So you kind of see what's going on here. You got this word, right? So what did you say she did? She holded the baby rabbits and we patted them. So you see the logic there? The child is saying patted and adding a syllable with patted, right? patted. So then the child adds a syllable with hold it. So did you say she held them tightly? No, she holded them loosely. You see, so even though the adult tries to imitate what we call the irregular stem changing verb in the past tense, hold, held, that, the child still doesn't imitate it. So the imitation doesn't seem to work initially, at least at young ages. Okay, let's look at correction reinforcement theory. Okay, if you want to define it, it's kind of like what it says, but children learn by being corrected when they're using the wrong forms of something, or they learn by being reinforced when they're doing the correct form of something. So you have the correction, the reinforcement occurs with the parents, and then children learn the language through both correction and through reinforcement. Strength. Maybe some language is acquired through correction by adults when the child uses the wrong forms. Weakness. Parents rarely correct children's grammatical errors. Instead, parents seem to focus more on the content rather than the grammar. In particular, parents focus more on whether or not the child's statement is true. Like I was saying a minute ago, the child says that's a cat, or if it's a dog or a cat or whatever it might be, the parents will correct the truth of the statement, but not the grammatical correctness of the statement. Even if adults attempt to correct the child's speech, it seems to fail, especially if the child is of a young age. So in this conversational exchange, it says, one psychologist tried over a period of several weeks to persuade his daughter to say other noun instead of other one noun. So let's see how that works out. So the child says, want other one spoon, Daddy? Do you want the other spoon? Yes, I want the other one spoon, please, Daddy. Can you say the other spoon? Other one spoon. Say other. Other spoon, spoon, other spoon, other spoon. Now give me the other one spoon. See how it works there? So it doesn't seem to be in this case that you had the researcher was explicitly trying to correct the child to say the right word. It still couldn't do it. And by the way, I have a grammar book that goes over the other, the others, another, variations of those words. And it's probably 8 or 9 pages of different stuff going on, but I'm like, wow, that's a lot more complicated than I thought it was, right? It seems easy, another one, or another plus a singular noun, that kind of a thing. So that would be the second one. And then you have the constructions of rules theory. This is the third theory. So the constructions of rules theory, it basically says that children, they use the environment, and from the environment, they seem to construct the language as they go along. And that helps explain why some of how the children communicate or how they speak might be different from what they hear in the environment. So it says children are actively involved in constructing the rules of language as they go along. That would be a definition for that one. Strength. Sometimes children overgeneralize and use a rule where it doesn't fit. An adult would never use it in that situation. Bringed, goed, singed, taked, eated, and doed. Strength. Children seem to be actively involved in figuring out the rules of the language as they go along. Weakness. Not all language may be acquired in this manner. So like I was saying, it looks like that the 3 theories individually, without respect to the other theories, they seem to explain some in part how children acquire the language. So if you take all 3, you have the constructions of rules theory, you have the reinforcement correction theory, and then you have the imitation theory. If you look at all 3 together, they seem to do a pretty good job explaining how children acquire a language. So that's kind of how it is. And this is kind of just a bit of just a dabble into psycholinguistics with child language acquisition. And remember that you can take a full course for a full semester. You could do a master's degree in just this, right? This is how complicated this stuff is, I think that's pretty much it for today. I think next class, we will get into my expertise, adult language acquisition. I learned Spanish as an adult. I have been teaching adults English for, 35 years, since the early 90s. So I have a pretty good idea of what the problems and the challenges are in that case. Okay, I think that's it for today.